The notice had been nailed to the door of the company house sometime before dawn, and when Nora Vane stepped out on the morning of October the 14th, 1882, to draw water, she found it curled at one corner already, the ink still sharp against the pale wood. She did not read it twice. She had understood its meaning from the first 3 words, and she stood for a long moment in the cold gulch air, with the paper held flat between her hands, looking out over Silver Creek Camp and the line of identical board houses running down toward the creek, gray in the early light, their stovepipes all breathing the same thin smoke. She thought of what her father Clem had told her once about what a mine looks like when the company has decided it is finished with a vein. "You can always tell," he said. "They stop oiling the hinges on the shaft doors." She had not yet understood what he meant by it. She did not yet know, standing on that step with the notice in her hands and her breath making small clouds in the October cold, that the thing she would need most in the months ahead was already waiting for her less than a quarter mile up the slope, sealed behind a plank door she had passed 100 times without stopping. But that is the character of inheritance. It sits quietly in front of you until the moment you are ready to see it, and then it is the only thing in the landscape. Dodd Holt, the company's camp overseer, had given her 14 days. Her husband Amos had been dead since August, taken by the collapse in the No. 7 drift on a Tuesday afternoon when the crew was pulling back the last of the timber to reclaim the iron fittings, and the house was company property, as was the cook stove and the window glass and the right to draw water from the company pipe. She had known since August that the notice was coming. She had known it the way you know a cold front is coming, from the way the light changes at the ridge, not from any particular sign, but from the accumulated reading of 100 prior days. She had spent the weeks between the funeral and the notice doing the kind of preparation that does not look like preparation from the outside, the kind that looks like a woman organizing her grief rather than her circumstances. She had taken stock of what was hers and what was the company's. The list of what was hers was short. She had her sister Ida, who was 17 that November, and had come up from the valley in August to help with the nursing, and had stayed because there was nowhere she was needed more. She had a dark-coated hound named Finn, 7 years old and slow in the joints, but fond of walking close to her heels when the wind came down from the ridge, his broad head even with her knee. She had 3 good wool blankets and a quilt that had been her mother's, a set of cooking irons, a hatchet, a pry bar, Amos's hunting knife, and 4 silver dollars in a leather pouch inside her boot. She had a tin box of dried seed from the autumn before, and she had her father Clem's survey notebook, a battered thing of brown leather with the cover warped from a long-ago soaking, its pages dense with his small, careful hand, his measurements and drawings and the occasional sentence he had set in the margins when something struck him as worth keeping. The notebook was the thing she checked on last when she made her inventory, and the thing she checked on first when she woke each morning, and it was the thing she was thinking of when she folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket and went back inside to make breakfast for herself and Ida and begin deciding what came next. Clem Vane had worked underground for 31 years in camps from Missouri to the Nevada Territory, and he had died the winter of 1878 with his lungs gone to dust, but his mind still exact and his hands still steady on a pencil. He had not left Nora a deed or a sum. What he had left her was the knowledge of how a mine shaft breathes, how the earth leans when it is wet and when it is cold, how to read the grain of timbering and the angle of the props to know whether a space underground will hold or fold under pressure. He had taught her in the way he taught everything, by standing beside her and speaking in plain sentences while she watched his hands. "A mine that is drained right will not flood," he said. "A mine that is timbered right will not pinch. A mine that is ventilated right will not kill you." He had told her all 3 on the same afternoon, when she was perhaps 14, and following him through an adit in the Colorado hills on a day off from the camp school. And she had gone home and written each sentence in the back of the notebook she had then, on the last clean page, so she would not lose the shape of them. That notebook had been lost in a later move, but the sentences had not been lost because they had been said aloud in her father's voice in a specific place at a specific time, and the things said that way do not usually leave. The principle he had pressed hardest, the one he had demonstrated twice with his own hands before she was grown, was the one about the Earth's direction of force. He had told her once when she was about 12 years old, watching him re-angle a prop that another man had set plumb, that most men who worked underground thought of the Earth's weight as coming straight down, the way rain comes, and that this was true as far as it went, but that it did not go far enough. The Earth leans, he had said. It leans because the ground above a tunnel is not a flat weight, but a curved arch of material under stress, and when it gets wet or freezes and thaws, the stress does not relieve straight down. It pushes outward, toward the walls. You have to give it somewhere to lean. That is not you. He splayed the prop's foot outward by 2 inches and pressed the heel of his palm against it to show her how it caught the lateral push and redirected it down through the floor. She had written that sentence in the back of the warped brown notebook many years later, in her own hand, below the last entry Clem had made. She thought of it when she walked up the slope on the morning of October the 15th, with Finn at her side and Sita a few steps behind, carrying a lantern in the gray early morning, and the notebook tucked inside her coat. The number 3 shaft had been abandoned 2 years prior, its vane pinched and played out, its door planked shut with 3 boards nailed diagonal. It sat in the hillside above the camp like something the mountain had exhaled, and then decided it did not need. Its adit framed in timber that was still sound, its entrance roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the slope of the hillside rising above it in a mat of scrub pine and loose shale. She worked the boards off with the pry bar and held the lantern inside. The shaft ran 42 feet into the hill, according to Clem's notebook, where it appeared in a survey he had done years before as part of a regional assessment of played-out workings. She had found that survey 2 years ago, and not known then why it mattered. The shaft was dry at the back, which she had expected, because the notebook also showed the drainage ditch the original crew had cut, along the uphill side of the entrance to divert the seep and groundwater that would otherwise collect against the adit sill. The ditch was still there, intact, still running its thin thread of water off to the east and away from the door. She held the lantern up to one of the props and studied the angle of the foot, splayed outward by 2 inches at least. The man who had timbered this shaft had understood the principle. The grain was tight. Finn sat in the entrance with his ears up and watched the light move on the walls. She spent that day and the next making the accounting of what the space would need and what she had to work with, the way her father had always made an accounting before touching anything underground. She measured the shaft's dimensions with a length of twine and a stick and noted them inside the notebook's back cover, in the space beside the sentences she had written there. She checked the ventilation. At the back of the shaft, in the deepest point of the adit, there was a crawl passage about 18 inches square that had been begun when the crew thought the vein might continue further, then abandoned when it did not. The passage ran back another 8 feet before ending in solid rock. A mine shaft with no ventilation path will fill with bad air over time and become uninhabitable, and a shaft with a stove burning in it will do so faster. Clem had written 3 paragraphs on this in the notebook, with a diagram showing how to extend a ventilation draw up through the hillside from a rear passage. And she studied those paragraphs for a long time, standing in the cold at the back of the shaft, with the lantern making her shadow large on the wall, Holt found her there 4 days later, on the 19th of October, when she and Ida were carrying straw bales up the slope from the company barn. She had left a note at the barn saying she was borrowing 5 bales and stating her intention to repay them in kind when she was able, which was the kind of note her father had always left when he borrowed from a company operation and expected to be treated as an honest party. Holt came around the bend in the path holding the note and found her and Ida stacking bales inside the shaft entrance, Finn lying across the threshold in the afternoon sun. Holt was a broad man of 50, well-fed by camp standards, with the particular self-assurance of a man who has been in authority long enough to assume it is the natural condition of things. He had a habit of working a wooden toothpick from one corner of his mouth to the other when he was choosing his words. He worked it twice before he spoke. He said he supposed she was comfortable enough in her hole. She said she supposed she would find out. He asked if she understood that the number 3 was a company property. She said she understood that it was a played-out working that had been abandoned for 2 years, and that she was not extracting ore, which was what the company's property claim pertained to. He looked at her for a moment with the toothpick still. Then he said she could stay until the snow came down to the creek level, at which point he expected she would have the good sense to come back into the camp and find a proper arrangement. She thanked him and went back to stacking bales. He told the men on the store porch about it that evening in the mild, amused tone of a man sharing an interesting peculiarity. He said the widow Vane was setting up housekeeping in the old number 3 hole up the slope, that she had her sister with her and her dog, and apparently some plan involving straw, and that he had told her she was welcome to the experiment as long as it lasted. Somebody on the porch said that was a hard way to spend a winter. Somebody else said it was no different from what a badger does. Holt worked the toothpick and said that Clem Vane's girl had always had a particular streak, and that this seemed to be where it had come out. They called her the Shaft Woman by the end of the week. The name traveled through the camp the way small names do, settling into the conversation as casually as a stone settling into mud, until it had always been there. She heard it and noted it and went back to her work. The work of making the shaft livable took her the whole of November and most of December. And it was careful work, not urgent work, the kind that rewards patience more than effort. She began with the insulation, lining the lower walls with straw bales set 2 deep, packing gray clay from the creek bank into every gap and seam until the barrier was solid from floor to 4 feet up on both long walls, because her father had told her the cold came first from the walls and only second from the air, that stone would wick heat from a body all night through a bedroll, and a person would wake thinking themselves warm and find they had been giving their warmth to the mountain. She raised the floor with a packed layer of creek gravel and then flat, dry-laid stone, so the moisture that crept up from below had somewhere to settle that was not the sleeping floor. She built this floor over the course of 3 days, carrying stone in a canvas sling from the creek bed below, Finn following her back and forth along the path with the methodical patience of a dog who has decided that wherever a person is going is probably worth going. She drove the ventilation pipe in early December when the ground was not yet frozen hard enough to resist the iron bar she used to start each hole. It was the most difficult part of the preparation, working the bar through 6 feet of shale and compacted soil from inside the crawl passage at the back, turning it by hand and packing the loose material back as she went, Ida holding the lantern and marking the angle with a string so the pipe would emerge on the hillside above and not in a drift of heavy snow. The pipe itself was a length of iron they had bought from the company store's scrap pile for 30 cents, just wide enough to draw air past a candle flame. When she pushed it through and felt it break into open air on the other side, and the current came down past her face, faint and cold and clean, She sat back on her heels in the crawl passage and stayed there for a moment. Ida called in from the main shaft, asking if it had gone through. It had gone through, Nora said. She said it the way her father used to say things he had expected, but was still grateful to have confirmed. The stove went in the second week of December. A small iron box they carried up the slope in pieces and reassembled on the raised stone floor. Its chimney pipe running up through a clay-packed hole in the ceiling she had reinforced with a ring of fitted stone. She burned a test fire that evening with just the three of them, counting 12 minutes from cold start to a steady heat, then watching the thermometer she had borrowed from the company infirmary. At 55 minutes, with a light snow falling outside and the camp below sitting at 22 degrees, the shaft interior held at 49. She wrote the number in the notebook beside the ventilation diagram, the way her father had always written test results beside the method that produced them. By Christmas, the space was fully settled as such a space can be, which is a different kind of settled than a house, but not a lesser one. The walls breathed out their stored warmth through the straw and clay. The stone floor stayed dry. The ventilation drew steadily from the entrance to the pipe, so the stove's smoke went up and out, and the air in the shaft always had the faint mineral tang of deep ground, rather than the close smell of burned wood. Finn had claimed a spot near the base of the stove where the stone held heat after the fire dropped, and he slept there each night with his chin on his paws and his eyes half open in the comfortable manner of a dog who has decided a place is his. Ida hung the flour sack curtain she had made to divide the sleeping area from the cooking area, and she had put a pine sprig above it on Christmas morning, which she did not explain and did not need to. The winter held cold through January and February, the snowpack building on the upper ridges through slow, steady accumulations that the old-timers at the camp said were the heaviest since 1874. The creek froze to the bottom in the shaded stretches below the lower camp row. The company houses heated with coal at a rate the company measured closely, and when the coal supply ran short in late January, the men at the store discussed how long the reserve might last with the particular muted anxiety of people who have not built for the worst case. Ruth Marsh, who kept a house 2 doors from where Nora's had been, had taken to leaving provisions at the top of the drainage ditch, dried beans and salt pork, and once a small wheel of pressed cheese wrapped in cloth, left without a note, because Ruth understood that the conversation she and Nora were having about the matter was taking place in a register that did not require words. Nora accepted the supplies and returned the containers and said nothing about it either way. In February, Holt made a longer speech at the store on a Saturday afternoon when the cold had kept men inside all day, and the conversation had grown dull enough that a fresh subject was welcome. Someone had asked after the shaft woman, and Holt had obliged with a full accounting of his views. He said that in 20 years of running mining camps he had seen women do a good number of foolish things in the first year of grief, and that moving into an abandoned working was near the top of the list. The bad air alone being enough to take a person's lungs, given enough seasons. The shaft air in a played-out working being different from a working drift and not in a favorable direction. He said that Clem Vane, for all his years underground, had been a man of the old school, self-taught and set in his methods, and that some of what the old-timers believed about timbering and drainage had been superseded by better engineering, and that the woman up there was trading on sentiment dressed up as knowledge. He worked the toothpick. He said he hoped she and her sister would come down before spring and find something sensible. Ruth was in the store that afternoon for flour, and said, without looking up from the counter, that in her experience, Nora Vane had always known what she was doing. Holt said that was a generous reading of the situation. The men on the bench by the window said nothing either way, which is how most men vote when they have decided the outcome but do not wish to be responsible for the counting. Word of the speech reached the shaft by the following Wednesday, carried by the mailboy who ran the mountain route, and felt that Nora deserved to hear the shape of what was being said. She was at the shaft entrance reading the notebook when the boy came up the path, and she listened to his account without changing her expression, asked him one question about whether Holt had mentioned the ventilation pipe specifically, and thanked him when he said he had not. Ida, washing a pot in the snowlight at the entrance, asked afterward if it bothered her. Nora said she supposed not. She said a man who had never spent a winter underground in a shaft he had built himself would not be the best judge of what kept warmth. She said it in the level tone of someone reporting a fact they have confirmed against their own experience and do not need outside agreement to hold on to. Then she put the notebook back on its shelf and went to check the drainage ditch, which had developed a small ice dam at the elbow the night before that needed clearing before the afternoon melt made it worse. She cleared the dam with the hatchet, working for 20 minutes in the cold, Finn watching from 3 feet away with the expression of a dog who has decided supervision is his appropriate contribution. She set the cleared ice in a pile to one side and checked the ditch's run from the top to where it met the lower slope, pressing her boot heel into the ground at the bend to test how the meltwater would take the curve when the real thaw came. The ditch was designed as her father had drawn it in the notebook, to handle 3 times the normal seep flow from the hillside. She had deepened it by 4 inches in November. She stood at the top of the ditch for a moment, looking down over the camp, at the row houses and the store and the company office and the ore house near the creek. A man from the lower row was crossing the yard below, and he looked up at her standing there on the hillside and looked away again without changing his pace. The way people in camps learn to look away from whatever they have decided not to understand. She was, to him and to most of the camp, still the shaft woman, still the widow Vane up in her hole. And she had been that long enough now that the label had stopped requiring anyone to say it aloud. She thought about what 19 feet of snowpack on the upper ridges would do to a camp built on a graded cut when the thaw came fast. Then she went back inside and made the midday meal and said nothing about it to Ida, because there was nothing yet to say, and because the thing she was thinking was not a fear but a preparation. The winter held through early March, which was normal enough for the high Nevada country, and the camp's old-timers said at the store that the thaw would be another month off at least, which was a reasonable thing to think on the 3rd of March, when a horse broke through the ice on a shallow creek crossing and had to be pulled out by a team. It was not a reasonable thing to think by the 9th. The temperature rose 34 degrees in 48 hours, beginning on the morning of the 9th of March, 1883. It came on a warm wind from the southwest, a high-country chinook that arrived without storm cloud or forewarning and settled over the ridge as if it had always been there, and the cold had been the disruption. The creek snow went in the first day. On the second day, the snowpack on the south-facing slopes above the camp was running in sheets, water moving under the surface skin of the old pack in dark stains that spread and joined as the afternoon went on. The drainage ditches in the upper camp were adequate for spring runoff delivered over 3 to 4 weeks, as spring runoff in that country normally came. They were not adequate for spring runoff delivered in 3 to 4 days. They choked inside of 12 hours. The ground, still frozen a foot below the surface, would not absorb what the thaw was sending down, and the water found the path of least resistance, which was, as water's path almost always is, the path that men had built without expecting to be tested by the worst version of things. Nora watched the water coming off the ridge from the shaft entrance on the evening of the 10th, standing with Finn beside her and the lantern lit behind her. The warm air smelling of wet stone and pine sap, and she went back inside and moved everything that could be moved to the highest shelf and the highest point of the raised stone floor. She set the notebook under her coat. Ida watched her without asking questions, which was one of the things about Ida that Nora had always valued, and began moving her own things by the same logic. Nora went down the slope that evening in the dark and told Ruth Marsh what she thought was coming, and said there was room in the shaft for Ruth and her daughter and anyone else Ruth considered worth telling. Ruth looked at her for a long moment in the doorway of the company house and then went inside to get her coat. The mudslide came at 3 in the morning on the 11th of March. It began above the upper camp, in a draw where the water table had been rising for 2 days and the frozen subsoil had used up its last capacity for resistance. The material came down not as a wall but as a slow, dense weight, filling ground floor windows before those inside had fully woken, pressing through the gaps in board siding with a pressure that was not violent but was absolute. The lower row of company houses, 11 of them, bore the leading edge of it. 3 were destroyed before morning, and 8 were left standing with their floors packed to the windowsills. 6 people were dead by dawn, and 38 were displaced, their houses standing but uninhabitable, their stoves cold, their food stores buried. The creek rose 22 feet over the following 18 hours, driven by the continuing melt from the upper ridges, and 4 more structures at the creek's edge went into the water or were condemned by the company's own assayer, who had some experience with such things. By the end of the first week, 14 structures had been formally declared uninhabitable. The camp had lost nearly a third of its housing in 4 days. The company's store held its coal reserve. The remaining families burned what they had. The number 3 shaft sat 11 feet above the mudline. The drainage ditch, cleared of its ice dam 12 days earlier and deepened in November to 4 times the original specification, carried the seep and the surface melt cleanly off to the east. So the added entrance ran with a thin stream along its sill but never flooded. The timbered walls, propped with their feet splayed outward at the angle Clem had described in his notebook, and that Nora had verified with her own palm before she trusted her life to them, distributed the lateral pressure of the wet hillside without shifting by so much as a quarter inch. She checked every prop by lantern light on the second day, while the slide was still moving lower on the slope, pressing her hand flat against each foot in turn, feeling for the give that would mean the earth had overcome the geometry. There was no give. The geometry held. Inside the shaft, with 7 people sheltered, including Ruth and her daughter, and a family of 4 from the lower row, whom Nora had brought up the slope herself in the dark hours before the slide's main movement. The temperature held at 52 degrees through the worst 3 days. The stove burned through a cord and a half of wood, which was what she had stacked against the back wall in November, against the kind of situation she had not wanted to explain to anyone. The ventilation pipe drew steadily, the air moving from the entrance to the back passage in its clean mineral current, so that with 7 people breathing in the closed space, the air never went bad, never grew the thick, closed feeling that bad shaft air gets when the oxygen is going. No one was sick. Finn lay across the base of the stove in his customary place and moved only to drink from the pot Ida kept filled with snowmelt near the entrance. On the second night, the family from the lower row, a husband and wife and 2 children, who had come up the slope with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, sat close together near the stove, and the husband held the smaller child on his knee and looked around at the stone walls and the clay-packed insulation and the neat stone floor and the shelf with the notebook on it, and said, more to himself than to anyone, that he had not understood what she was building up here. Nora said it was her father's building more than hers. The husband said that was maybe so. Then nobody said anything for a while, which was the right thing. There is a kind of proof that no argument can proceed, because it arrives before the argument has anywhere left to stand. The mudslide was that kind of proof. Holt came up the path on the morning of the 14th after the creek had dropped enough to make the lower camp passable on foot. He had been working in the lower camp for 2 days, helping with the recovery, and his coat was mired to the knee and his face had the drawn look of a man who has been moving too long through other people's losses. He stood at the shaft entrance for a moment, looking in at the stove, the raised stone floor, the people seated around the heat, the curtain Ida had hung across the middle of the space. He looked at the drainage ditch carrying its clear, thin line of water off to the east, away from the entrance, exactly as it had been designed to carry it. He looked at the timbering, the old props set at their angle, unchanged and unshifted through everything the hillside had given these last 4 days. He looked at Clem's survey notebook on its shelf, the brown leather warped at the cover, its pages dense with the small, careful hand of a man who had spent 31 years underground and left his daughter everything that knowledge amounted to. He stood at the entrance with his hat in his hands, and Ruth and her daughter looked up at him from beside the stove, and the family from the lower row looked up at him, and Ida looked up at him from the curtain's edge, and Nora stood at the back near the ventilation pipe with her hand resting flat against one of the props, where it had been when he came through the entrance, as if she had been checking the timber and had simply not moved when she heard him approach. She said nothing. The space said everything there was to say. Holt looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up at Nora. "She built this right," he said. He said it quietly in the tone of a man arriving somewhere he had taken a long time to reach. Then he put his hat back on and went back down the slope. It was not an apology. Nora did not take it as one. She turned and checked the stove's draft and set another piece of wood on, and went back to what she had been doing, which was making a count of their remaining provisions against the number of people in the shaft and the number of days before the camp supply line would be restored. She said nothing about Holt's visit to anyone. There was nothing that needed saying about it. The camp spent 2 weeks in the aftermath, assessing losses and clearing mud, and deciding what could be rebuilt and what needed to wait for better ground. Warren Alt, a territorial survey man who happened to be traveling through Silver Creek Gulch on his way to the upper claims with a commission to document the slide damage, stopped to make his drawings and stayed 5 days, and on the 4th day he walked up the slope to the number 3 shaft with a ledger under his arm and spent the better part of an afternoon asking Nora questions about the drainage ditch and the timbering angle and the ventilation pipe and the insulation method, going through each element in the order she explained it and writing it down in the precise way of a man who is committing something to a permanent record. She showed him Clem's notebook, and he copied from it carefully, asking her permission for each page he transcribed, his pen moving with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that the thing he is copying took a long time to make. He asked her where her father had learned the drainage method. She said she supposed from the same place her father had learned everything, which was from the ground itself, from watching what the water did and then changing what it was going to do next. Warren wrote that down too. He said he had surveyed mining camps across 3 territories and that the most complete application of working drift principles to habitation he had ever encountered was sitting in this hillside above Silver Creek, and that it ought to be on record somewhere that could be found. She said that was kind of him. He said it was not kindness, it was accuracy. Warren's survey report was submitted to the territorial office in 1884, in a bound volume documenting the slide and its aftermath, and it included a section on the use of abandoned mine adits for emergency and permanent habitation in high country camps. The section detailed the 3 principles Clem had taught and Nora had applied, with drawings copied from the notebook and notes on materials and dimensions and the rationale for each decision, written in the plain language of a man who understood that a good report is one that a person can follow without needing to have met the person who wrote it. The report was not widely read in the way that published books are read, because territorial survey reports are not published books, but it circulated among mining engineers and camp superintendents and territorial administrators in the region with the steady, patient thoroughness that printed documents sometimes achieve when they answer a practical question that people have been living with without knowing how to answer it. By the summer of 1885, two families in the Upper Claims had moved permanently into shafts they had retrofitted using the principles in the report, and a third had used those principles to build a hybrid structure, half dug into the hillside and half framed above it, with the drainage and ventilation carried through in the way Clem had described. The camp gave this structure a name. They called it a vein house, for the woman who had first shown them what the old knowledge could do when the new confidence had run out of room. Ruth Marsh lived in a vein house for the last 11 years of her life, and said more than once, to whoever would listen, that she was warmer in it than she had been in any company house she had ever occupied, and that the only regret she had about the matter was that she had waited for a mudslide to teach her what a woman with a father's notebook had been trying to demonstrate all winter. Ida married a surveyor named Thomas Hale in 1886 and moved down to the valley, but she kept the flour sack curtain folded in a cedar chest for the rest of her life. And when her children asked what it was, she told them it was a curtain from the house, where she had learned that warmth was not a thing that came from money or from other people's permission. The family from the lower row, the husband and wife and 2 children, named their second son Clement, which was Clem Vane's full given name, and said when asked that it was for a man they had never met, but whose work had kept them through the worst 3 days of their lives. Holt resigned his post in the autumn of 1883 and went to work for a different company operation farther south, in a drier climate. It was said that in his first year at the new camp, he applied for a permit to retrofit an abandoned adit near the cookhouse as emergency shelter, citing the precedent at Silver Creek Gulch. Whether he credited Clem Vane's notebook by name in the application, the record does not say. Knowledge finds its way. It goes through the hands that will take it and the minds that will keep it, whether or not the people on the store porch had anything good to say about it in February. This was what Clem had understood, and what he had been trying to give his daughter with the notebook and the years of plain sentences beside the props and the measurements written in the margins. He had not left her money. He had left her the thing that could not be taken away by a notice on a door or a company overseer working a toothpick while he waited for winter to prove him right. The number 3 shaft itself was never reclaimed for mining. After the camp diminished, as such camps do when the ore runs thin and the men go elsewhere looking for a better grade, the shaft sat in the hillside as it had sat for 30 years, its timbering sound, its drainage ditch still carrying its thin, clear thread of water off to the east and away from the door in all seasons, through the snowmelt and the August dry and the first hard freeze each November. The scrub pine grew back thick on the slope above the adit over the years, and the low brush advanced across the entrance until only the top of the timber frame was visible from the path below, a dark rectangle in the green of the hillside, easy to overlook. The path itself grew over, and then the camp's other tracks grew over too, and the ore house and the store and the company office fell to the weather. One board at a time, the way abandoned things do, returning to the hill's general material. In late March, every year, when the snowmelt was running off the upper ridges and the ground was too frozen still to absorb what the sky was sending down, the drainage ditch Clem had designed and Nora had kept was still doing its work. You could follow it with your eye if you stood in the right place on the slope, a dark, clean seam cutting diagonally across the face of the hill, carrying the water away from the door, eastward, down, and away, in the quiet, exact way that a well-taught thing continues doing what it was taught long after the teacher is gone and the student is gone, and even the argument about whether it mattered has been swallowed by time and pine and the patient weather. It carries still,